The prairie, endless and quiet, stretches in every direction. A sea of grass that once waved beneath summer winds now lies muted under the weight of frost. To imagine the life of pioneer families here is to step into a world of both silence and struggle. There were no highways, no city lights, and perhaps most significantly, no stores waiting at the edge of town with shelves stocked full of bread, firewood, or warm blankets. The prairie was vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. Families who came west to settle its open lands had only what they could carry, what they could build, and what they could create with their own hands. In the 21st century, winter may be a season of inconvenience, snow shovels, delayed traffic, and the occasional power outage. But for settlers of the 19th century, a prairie winter was something far more daunting. It was a question of survival. When the last wagon rolled away from a distant trading post in autumn, or when the first heavy snow blocked trails and roads, there was no guarantee that a family would see spring again. Food, warmth, shelter, and companionship became precious resources, and every choice made before the first frost would decide the outcome of the long, cold months ahead. To understand how they survived, one must first consider the isolation. Many homesteads were built far from one another, separated by miles of grassland or scattered groves of trees. A journey to a neighbor could take hours, and a trip to a town, if one existed nearby at all, could consume an entire day in fair weather, or become impossible once the snow piled high. When the storm winds howled across the plains, families were sealed inside their cabins, sometimes for weeks at a time. There was no shop to run to, no warm inn around the corner. Everything had to be planned, stored, and prepared long in advance. And yet, despite the harshness, families endured. Children were born, meals were shared, songs were sung, and spring did eventually return. The survival of pioneer families was not simply a matter of luck. It was the result of careful preparation, unyielding labor, and a kind of resilience that grew from both necessity and faith. Their story is not one of heroics in the traditional sense. It is quieter, slower, and deeply human. It is the story of people learning to live with the land, to make peace with its challenges, and to trust that their own determination would carry them through. As we begin this journey into their world, let us set aside our modern comforts for a moment. Imagine waking up to the sound of the wind pressing against the wooden walls of a cabin. The air inside is cold, your breath visible in the dim light. Outside, the prairie lies blanketed in snow, silent except for the occasional call of a crow. There is no grocery store to restock supplies, no furnace that hums on command. There is only the fire you tended through the night, the food you preserved during the summer, and the walls you built with your own hands. This is where our story unfolds. The purpose of this exploration is not to dramatize hardship, but rather to understand it in its ordinary, everyday form. The families who came to the prairie were not warriors or conquerors. Most were farmers, laborers, immigrants seeking land and a chance to build something new. They did not view themselves as extraordinary, and yet their ability to endure the winters without modern support systems is remarkable. By examining the rhythms of their lives, the building of shelter, the storing of food, the weaving of clothing, and the forming of community, we begin to see how survival was possible, and even how moments of comfort and peace could be found amidst the cold. As this documentary unfolds, each section will follow a natural rhythm, much like the seasons themselves. We will begin with the prairie in warmer months, when families prepared for the winter ahead. We will then move slowly into the descent of cold weather, and follow the settlers into their homes, around their fires, and through the routines that carried them forward, day by day. Along the way we will notice the quiet details, the crackle of firewood, the sound of a loom, the creak of a cabin door beneath the weight of snow. These details, while small, were the texture of survival. It is worth remembering, too, that these families did not live entirely without joy. Even as they battled the elements, they found ways to make life meaningful. Storytelling by lamplight, the laughter of children, or the quiet peace of watching snow fall against the window. All of these moments remind us that survival was not only about enduring hardship, but also about holding on to humanity. So let us begin gently, with patience and curiosity. As we walk beside these families through history, we will not rush, for their lives were not rushed. We will notice the small things, the practical things, and the deeply human things that allowed them to live through winters on the prairie, without the safety net of stores. This is not a tale of excitement or of grand events, but of quiet persistence, and in its calm, steady rhythm, we may find a kind of relaxation ourselves, as though history's stillness might help us breathe a little more deeply tonight. Before the snows came, before the prairie winds hardened into sharp blades of ice, life on the plains had a very different rhythm. The warmer seasons were not only times of growth and abundance, but also of preparation. For pioneer families, the months of spring, summer, and autumn were a careful balance of work and rest, hope and worry. Each day was lived with the knowledge that winter was approaching, and that everything accomplished beneath the sun would one day be measured against the cold. The prairie itself in those months before winter was a place of beauty and quiet grandeur. Grass stretched as far as the eye could see, rolling in endless waves like an ocean turned green and gold. Wildflowers blossomed in patches, coloring the horizon with gentle shades of purple, yellow, and white. The sky seemed impossibly wide, a canvas that shifted from blazing blue to the deep oranges and pinks of long sunsets. In this vastness, families carved out homesteads, small cabins of logs or sod, gardens fenced with rough timber, and fields that had been plowed by hand or with the strength of a single ox. Life was not easy, but the warmth of the sun softened the edges of hardship. Children might run barefoot through tall grass, chasing after grasshoppers or gathering wild berries. Women tended gardens where beans, squash, and potatoes pushed up from the earth. Men labored in the fields, cutting hay or repairing fences. Each task carried weight, for every bucket of vegetables harvested or bundle of hay stacked meant security for the winter months to come. Yet, in the moment, the air was filled not only with labor but also with life. Birdsong in the morning, the hum of insects at midday, and the quiet chorus of crickets as evening fell. Summer was a time of relative comfort, though it was never without its challenges. Rain could flood fields, drought could shrivel crops, and prairie fires could sweep across the land with terrifying speed. But for most families, the warm months represented opportunity. Crops grew tall beneath the long daylight hours. Livestock fattened on grass, tools could be mended, barns expanded, and new land broken for future planting. The prairie was alive with possibility, and every bit of work was a quiet investment against the silence of winter. By late summer, a sense of urgency began to grow. The days shortened. The air carried hints of coolness at night. Families knew that winter was no distant idea. It was a certainty, and one that demanded readiness. Gardens were harvested carefully. Corn was dried and stored. Apples, when available, were preserved in jars or pressed into cider. Meat from hunting or butchering was smoked, salted, or dried into jerky. In every cabin, shelves were lined with jars, sacks, and bundles. Root cellars were dug deeper, their dark, cool interiors packed with potatoes, turnips, and carrots that would last for months if kept safe from frost. Autumn on the prairie was not only a season of work but also of beauty and quiet reflection. Trees along rivers blazed with gold and red. Fields of grain shimmered beneath low sunlight, ready for harvest. The first frosts painted the grass silver in the mornings, reminding families of the cold that was creeping closer. Yet autumn also carried a sense of peace. There was satisfaction in seeing the shelves fill with food, the barns stacked with hay, the woodpile growing taller with each passing week. It was a season when labor and reward stood side by side, offering families a brief moment to breathe before the storms arrived. Community, too, played a part in these months. Though homesteads were far apart, autumn often brought neighbors together for harvest gatherings, barn raisings, or shared meals. Families exchanged goods, lent tools, or traded labor. A neighbor might bring extra seed or help repair a leaking roof. These small acts of cooperation carried deep importance, for every family knew that the strength of one was tied to the survival of all. In a land where isolation was the rule, even a single day spent with others provided comfort that would linger through the winter's long nights. For the children of the prairie, these months were remembered with a special kind of fondness. Though they worked alongside their parents, gathering eggs, carrying water, or helping in the garden, they also enjoyed the freedom of the open land. Games were played in the fields, and evenings were spent around lamplight listening to stories. Sometimes traveling ministers or teachers passed through, bringing with them books, news, or hymns that connected the prairie to a wider world. These visits were rare, but they left lasting impressions on young minds. In every season before winter, The landscape itself guided the rhythm of life. The prairie's open expanse meant there were no mountains to block the wind, no dense forests to hide in. The land was both a blessing and a challenge, fertile enough to grow crops, but vulnerable to storms and fire. Families learned to read its signs, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the patterns of bird migrations, the sudden stillness in the air that often came before dramatic change. The prairie did not offer easy answers, but for those who paid attention, it revealed quiet lessons in survival. As autumn deepened, the preparation became more intense. Men spent long days cutting and stacking firewood, knowing that every missing log might mean a night of shivering. Women busied themselves with sewing, patching worn clothing, knitting wool socks, and making quilts thick enough to cover a family through freezing nights. Children gathered kindling, carried water, or helped fill the cellar. The whole household moved in steady rhythm, each task small but essential. No one could afford idleness, for winter was not forgiving, and yet, there was joy in the gathering. Families might share a final outdoor meal before the cold set in, enjoying roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and the last fruits of the season. A sense of gratitude filled those moments, for though the coming months would be hard, there was reassurance in knowing that the shelves were not bare, the woodpile was not empty, and the family was together under one roof. When we picture the prairie world before winter, we must imagine both the beauty and the weight of responsibility. The land glowed with sunsets and whispered with grasses, but beneath its loveliness lay a constant reminder: winter was coming. For the pioneers, this knowledge did not bring fear so much as determination. They had chosen this life, left behind other places to settle here, and their resilience was measured not only in what they endured, but in how carefully they prepared. The prairie before winter was alive with motion, sound, and color. It was a time when families worked with the land rather than against it, knowing that every harvest stored, every fence repaired, and every garment sewn was a quiet promise against the hardships ahead. In the calm before the snow, the pioneers lived fully, working, laughing, and dreaming, while holding in their hearts the steady truth that survival depended on what they accomplished beneath the fading warmth of the sun. Winter on the prairie did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly like a quiet guest who first knocked softly at the door before settling in for a long stay. At first, the change was subtle. The evening air carried a sharper bite, the sun dipped below the horizon earlier, and the leaves along creeks and riverbanks deepened to russet and gold. These signs were familiar to every pioneer family, for they marked the turning of the seasons, and with them the reminder that time was running short. The first frosts were almost beautiful. A thin lace of ice formed on puddles, cracking delicately under a boot heel. Grass bent beneath a silver glaze that shimmered in the morning light. Children sometimes marveled at this transformation, drawing patterns in the frost with their fingers or watching their breath cloud the air. But for their parents, the frost carried no charm. It was a warning. Gardens that had produced fresh vegetables for months could wither in a single cold night. What had not been harvested, preserved, or stored was now at risk of being lost entirely. Families hurried to gather the last potatoes, to pull the final carrots from the soil, to pick what remained of beans and corn before the killing frost left nothing behind. By late autumn, the prairie winds began to change character. What had once been warm breezes became cold gusts sweeping across the grasslands with unsettling force. There were no mountains or forests to shield the homesteads, just open space where the wind could race unchecked for miles. Families reinforced their cabins, stuffing cracks between logs with moss, mud, or strips of cloth. Windows, if they had them, were covered with oiled paper or old quilts to block drafts. Every nail hammered and every gap sealed was another small defense against the bitter air that would soon press against their walls. Snow did not always come early, but when it did, it arrived as both wonder and threat. The first snowfall might be light, a gentle dusting that softened the landscape and turned the endless grass into a field of white. For children it was a delight, an opportunity to leave footprints in fresh powder, to laugh as flakes landed on their eyelashes. For adults it was a sobering reminder of what lay ahead. A light snow could melt in a day, but it announced the inevitability of heavier storms to come. Once the prairie was covered in snow, travel became far more difficult. Roads vanished. Trails disappeared. A short walk to fetch water or check on livestock could turn exhausting in the deep drifts. The deepening cold also changed daily rhythms. Water buckets froze solid overnight, forcing families to break ice for drinking. The simple act of washing clothes or dishes became a greater effort, requiring heated water and quick hands before it turned cold again. Livestock needed extra care. Cows and horses were brought close to barns or sheltered with makeshift windbreaks. Every creature, human or animal, now faced the same enemy, the prairie winter. One of the most dramatic signs of winter's arrival was the stillness that settled across the land. Birds that had filled the summer sky with song flew south. Insects vanished. The rustling of grasses grew muted beneath frost and snow. Even the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. On calm days the silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the creak of frozen branches or the far-off call of a crow. On storm days, however, silence gave way to a different force entirely: the howl of blizzards, the whistle of wind around cabin corners, and the relentless rattle of snow against doors and windows. For the pioneers, each new storm tested their readiness. The first heavy snow could last for days, piling high against walls and fences. Families often stayed indoors, unable to venture out until the skies cleared. Candles or oil lamps glowed softly in the dim cabins, their light a fragile defense against the long nights. Fires burned constantly, tended with care to keep the chill from creeping inside. Each time the wind howled outside, families drew closer together, listening to the storm rage while they remained cocooned in their small but vital shelters. Emotionally, the coming of winter carried mixed feelings. There was pride in seeing shelves stocked with food, bins filled with grain, and woodpiles stacked neatly. Preparation had paid off, at least for now, but there was also apprehension. No one could predict exactly how harsh the season would be. Some winters brought only moderate snow and manageable cold. Others stretched on with relentless storms, weeks of below-zero temperatures, and blizzards that buried cabins up to their roofs. Families hoped for the former, but prepared for the latter, knowing that survival depended on expecting the worst. The shorter days altered the pace of life. Where summer had offered long hours of light for work, winter narrowed the window. Sunsets came early, and nights seemed endless. This shift brought families closer to their firesides, where evenings were filled with small tasks: mending clothes, carving tools, or reading aloud from a Bible or treasured book. The outside world grew distant, separated by snowdrifts and cold, while the interior of the cabin became the entire universe for weeks at a time. Yet, in the midst of hardship, there was also a certain rhythm and peace to winter's arrival. The land, which had demanded such constant labor in summer and autumn, now rested. Fields lay dormant beneath the snow. Gardens slept in silence. Families, too, adjusted to this slower pace, finding moments of calm in the steady crackle of a fire, in the quiet work of sewing, or in the shared stories that passed time during long nights. In this way, the coming of winter was not only a season of threat, but also one of reflection. Pioneers measured their strength not in grand gestures but in daily endurance. Each log added to the fire, each meal stretched to feed a family, each night passed in warmth rather than cold, was a small victory. And with every victory came the hope that, no matter how long or severe the season, spring would eventually return. Thus, winter's approach was both feared and respected. It was a teacher as much as an adversary, reminding families of their dependence on the land, their need for preparation, and their resilience in the face of uncertainty. The prairie did not forgive carelessness, but it also rewarded patience, diligence, and determination. The coming of winter was the great test, and every family who faced it learned something of themselves, of their neighbors, and of the land they called home. When we think of survival on the prairie, food and fire often come to mind. But before any meal could be preserved or any log placed on the hearth, there was a more urgent need: shelter. For pioneer families, a home was not simply a place to rest. It was a fortress against the relentless winds, a shield from snow, and a barrier that stood between life and the deadly cold. Without it, no amount of preparation would matter. The prairie winters could take everything from those who had no walls to stand behind. The building of shelter began long before the first frost. For many families arriving in spring or summer, the first weeks on new land were consumed with the task of creating some form of dwelling. Unlike wooded regions where logs were plentiful, the prairie often offered little timber. Families had to adapt, using whatever the land provided. Some built log cabins if they were lucky enough to settle near rivers or wooded groves. Others turned to sod houses, cutting thick slabs of prairie grass and stacking them like bricks. Still others dug into the earth itself, creating dugouts carved into hillsides or banks, where soil became both wall and insulation. The log cabin was perhaps the most iconic symbol of pioneer life, yet on the open prairie it was not always possible. Trees were scarce, and those that existed were often twisted and small from enduring the winds. A family might spend days hauling timbers from miles away or trade with neighbors for lumber. When built, cabins were simple: four walls of logs notched together, a roof of split wood covered with sod or shingles, and a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all in one. Cracks between logs were filled with mud or clay, a process known as chinking, which kept drafts from slipping through. The sod house, or soddy, was far more common in the treeless plains. Thick blocks of soil, held together by deep grass roots, were cut with a spade or special plough. Each block was heavy, sometimes weighing more than 50 pounds, but sturdy. Stacked carefully, they created walls that were cool in summer and remarkably warm in winter. Sod houses blended into the landscape, their earthy smell lingering indoors, their walls alive with small roots. Roofs were often made of wood beams layered with more sod, which could sprout grass even as families lived beneath them. These homes were far from glamorous. Rain sometimes dripped through the roof, and insects occasionally found their way inside, but they were strong, reliable, and built from the very land itself. For families who arrived too late in the year to build a cabin or soddy, the dugout was often the only option. Carved into a hillside or bank, these homes used the earth as natural insulation. A wooden frame might support the entrance, and sometimes a roof of logs or sod completed the structure. Life inside a dugout was dim, the walls rough and damp, but in the depths of winter the surrounding earth held in heat. For many pioneers, the dugout was not a permanent home but a first step, a temporary refuge until a sturdier cabin could be built the following year. No matter the type of home, preparation for winter was essential. Families spent autumn reinforcing walls, patching roofs, and sealing gaps. Windows were few, and those that existed might be covered with greased paper to allow light while blocking wind. Quilts, rugs, or even animal hides were hung over doors and windows to add insulation. Fireplaces or wood stoves were placed carefully, their chimneys built with stones or clay to carry smoke safely away. The hearth became the heart of the home, and the structure itself was built around it. Inside, the furnishings were simple but purposeful. Beds were often made from rough timber, filled with straw or corn husks, and covered in handmade quilts. Tables and benches were crafted from planks. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved food, tools, and the few treasured possessions families carried west. Every object had a place, for clutter wasted space, and space inside these small homes was precious. In most cases, one room served every purpose: cooking, eating, sleeping, working. Privacy was nearly non-existent, but the closeness of family was a source of warmth in itself. The role of shelter was more than physical, it carried emotional weight. To step inside a cabin or sod house as the wind howled outside was to feel safe, if only for a moment. The walls were not perfect, the roof sometimes leaked, and the cold often found its way in, but compared to the vast empty prairie, the home was a sanctuary. It was where children laughed, where meals simmered, where prayers were spoken before bed. In the heart of winter, when days grew long and dark, the home was a small world of its own, a refuge built by hands that refused to surrender to the land's challenges. Still, building shelter was never a one-time effort. Maintenance continued throughout the winter. Roofs had to be cleared of heavy snow lest they collapse. Chimneys needed regular attention to prevent smoke from filling the room. Drafts had to be checked and patched, often with strips of cloth or mud mixed with straw. Firewood was stacked close to the door, not just for convenience but to minimize the risk of exposure when storms made even a short walk dangerous. Every day brought small tasks to keep the shelter strong, and every small task carried great importance. Neighbors sometimes helped in the building process. Barn raisings, though more common in wooded regions, also took place on the prairie when resources allowed. Families gathered to lift beams, to share tools, and to lend skills. In return, food and fellowship were offered, turning hard labor into moments of community. These shared efforts were not only practical, they reminded families that they were not entirely alone. A cabin raised with the help of neighbors held not just walls and a roof, but also the memory of laughter, conversation, and shared strength. For all their effort, Pioneer shelters were modest by modern standards. They lacked insulation, running water, or sturdy foundations. Yet, within their earthen or wooden walls, families survived winters that could kill in a single night of exposure. Shelter was never taken for granted. Each creak of the roof, each whistle of wind through a crack, reminded families of the line between comfort and danger. And yet, there was beauty in these humble homes. A soddy glowing with lamplight under a starlit prairie sky. A cabin door opening to reveal smoke curling from a chimney, promising warmth within. A dugout carved into a hillside, barely visible beneath snow, holding the life of a family safe inside. These images, simple as they are, capture the resilience of those who built not just shelters but lives, out of the raw materials of the prairie. In the end, shelter was more than survival, it was belonging. It marked a claim upon the land, a promise to endure, and a declaration of hope. The walls may have been rough, the floors uneven, and the roofs imperfect, but they represented something larger, the determination of ordinary people to carve stability out of uncertainty. And as the first true storms of winter swept across the prairie, it was these shelters, humble, sturdy, and filled with human warmth, that stood as the final defense between families and the vast, unforgiving cold. If shelter was the first defense against winter, food was the second. A warm fire could protect a family through the night, but without something to eat, days would become unbearable, and health would falter quickly. On the prairie, where no stores stood waiting with stocked shelves, survival depended entirely on what could be grown, gathered, hunted, and preserved in the months before the cold set in. Every seed planted in spring, every jar sealed in autumn, every animal raised through summer carried with it the weight of winter survival. The rhythm of food preparation began long before the frost. In summer, gardens grew as families tended beans, squash, potatoes, carrots, and corn. These crops were not merely seasonal luxuries, they were investments, intended to last far beyond their harvest. By August, families began setting aside portions for storage. Corn was dried on the cob, beans strung on threads and hung near stoves, root vegetables laid carefully in cool cellars. The abundance of summer, fleeting though it was, had to be stretched into the hunger months of January and February. Preservation was an art as much as a necessity. Without refrigeration, families relied on methods as old as civilization itself, drying, salting, smoking, and storing in the earth. Meats, often butchered in late autumn when the weather turned cold enough to help preserve them, were hung in smokehouses. The slow burning of hickory or oak flavored the meat, driving away insects and sealing it against decay. Salt, when available, was used to cure pork or beef, drawing out moisture and preventing spoilage. These preserved cuts could be eaten months later, boiled into stews or sliced thin to be shared sparingly. Vegetables and fruits required equal care. Apples, if a family was fortunate enough to have an orchard nearby, could be stored in barrels packed with straw or sawdust to keep them from rotting. Potatoes, turnips, and carrots were buried in root cellars, where the steady cool temperature kept them edible deep into winter. Pumpkins and squash, with their thick skins, could last for months if kept dry. Every item had its place, its method of preservation, and its purpose. A well-stocked cellar was a quiet reassurance that even in February, when the land lay barren, the family would not go hungry. Canning was a labor-intensive process that became more common later in the 19th century as glass jars and sealing methods became more available. Women boiled fruits, vegetables, and jams, sealing them in jars with wax or tin lids. The process required patience and attention, but the reward was jars lined neatly on shelves, each one a small promise against the scarcity to come. Peaches, beans, pickles, and preserves all captured the taste of summer, waiting to be opened when the snow was thickest outside. For many families, livestock provided both food and security. Chickens laid eggs well into the colder months, though their production slowed in the deep cold. Cows and goats, if fed with stored hay, could give milk, which in turn became butter or cheese. Pigs were often slaughtered in late autumn, their meat salted, smoked, or packed in barrels. Nothing was wasted, the fat rendered into lard, the bones boiled into broth, the hides used for clothing or blankets. Each animal represented not only a source of food but also a measure of how carefully a family had prepared. Hunting and gathering supplemented stored supplies, though they were never reliable enough to depend on alone. In autumn, men hunted deer, rabbits, or wild birds, adding meat to smokehouses or cellars. Children collected wild berries or nuts when they could be found, though these were often consumed quickly. The prairie itself provided some resources: wild plums, choke cherries, and even prairie turnips. But once snow fell, these sources disappeared. Hunting in winter was possible but risky. Storms could make travel dangerous, and game grew scarce. Thus, while hunting might bring a fresh rabbit to the table in January, survival could never rest on chance alone. The careful rationing of food was just as important as its storage. Families knew that eating too generously in December could mean hunger in March. Meals were planned with frugality in mind. Stews stretched small amounts of meat with potatoes, carrots, and beans. Cornbread was a staple, filling and simple to make from stored cornmeal. Dried fruits sweetened porridge, or were reserved as treats for children. Coffee, if it had been traded for in town, was used sparingly, each cup a reminder of distance from the outside world. Tea brewed from herbs or bark substituted when supplies ran out. In this way, food took on meaning beyond nourishment. It became a measure of security, a symbol of a family's foresight and labor. To see shelves lined with jars, barrels filled with grain, and bins full of root vegetables was to feel the comfort of preparation. Each item stored represented a day of safety, another step closer to spring. Families who failed to store enough, whether through bad harvests or lack of planning, faced the winter with dread. Hunger was no stranger to the prairie, and many stories survive of families stretching their supplies to the very limit, boiling thin soups, grinding acorns into flour, or relying on neighbors for small acts of charity. Food was also a source of community. Neighbors sometimes gathered for butchering days, where hogs or cattle were slaughtered, and the work shared among families. The labor was heavy, but the presence of others brought comfort and efficiency. Women exchanged recipes for preserving, or shared jars of pickles or jams as small gifts. A borrowed sack of flour, or a traded portion of beans might mean the difference between hunger and health. In this way, food connected households, weaving a network of mutual survival across the otherwise isolated prairie. Winter meals, though simple, carried warmth in their ritual. A pot of stew simmering over the fire, the smell filling the cabin, became more than just a meal. It was a reminder that life continued even as the winds raged outside. Children gathered around tables built by their fathers, eating cornbread baked in iron skillets or butter spread on coarse bread. Even the humblest meals carried meaning, for they were the product of months of effort, and each bite was drawn from the earth and the labor of hands. At times, food shortages tested families deeply. Some winters proved harsher than expected, with storms that trapped families indoors for weeks, preventing them from reaching stored supplies in outbuildings. Others saw cellars flood or jars spoil. When this happened, meals grew meager. Yet even in scarcity, families learned to endure. They relied on creativity, turning scraps into sustenance, stretching portions with ingenuity. Hunger was never welcomed, but resilience grew from its presence. Food then was not simply stored, it was guarded, respected, and cherished. It represented not only the survival of individuals but of traditions. Recipes were handed down, preservation techniques taught to daughters and sons, knowledge passed like heirlooms. Every jar sealed, every ham smoked, every loaf baked connected families to those who came before, and those who would come after. In the end, survival on the prairie was not about abundance, but about enough. Enough potatoes to last until spring, enough beans to keep a stew going, enough flour to bake bread through the cold months, enough to see a family safely through the season, when the land offered nothing, and the prairie lay silent under snow. To open a root cellar door in February, and see food waiting, was to know that despite the hardships, life would continue. And in that quiet assurance lay the strength to face another day of winter. If food was the promise of survival, warmth was its daily necessity. A well-stocked cellar could protect against hunger, but without fire, even the most resilient family could not endure the prairie cold. Winter on the plains was not only about the absence of warmth, it was about the constant battle to create and preserve it. Every ember in the hearth, every log stacked in the woodshed, and every flicker of light from the stove became a lifeline through nights that seemed endless. The hearth stood at the center of pioneer life, both physically and symbolically. In cabins and sod houses, the fireplace or stove was the gathering place, the one spot where the cold could be held at bay. Families often arranged their lives around it, beds pulled close on the harshest nights, chairs drawn near for evening reading or sewing, meals prepared within arm's reach of the fire. The hearth was more than functional, it was the heart of the household. Its warmth carried comfort, its light offered reassurance, and its steady flame reminded all within the cabin that they were still safe. The first step in securing this warmth began long before winter's arrival. Gathering firewood was a year-round task, though it intensified in late summer and autumn. On the open prairie, trees were often scarce, forcing families to be resourceful. Where wood was plentiful, men and boys cut logs, split them into manageable pieces, and stacked them carefully to dry. Where trees were absent, settlers turned to alternatives: dried buffalo chips, twisted bundles of prairie grass, or even corn cobs saved from the harvest. Each fuel source came with its own challenges. Wood burned longer and steadier, but might require days of travel to gather. Grass burned quickly, requiring constant tending. Corn cobs provided warmth, but produced little heat compared to oak or hickory. Yet, no matter the source, every scrap of burnable material was precious. Once winter settled in, managing fuel became an art of conservation. Families had to balance the need for warmth with the risk of running short before spring. Fires were banked at night, covered with ashes to preserve embers until morning. A well-banked fire meant the family would not wake to a freezing cabin and the chore of striking flint in the dark cold. Children often carried the responsibility of tending flames, learning from an early age the importance of never letting the fire die completely. A moment's neglect could mean hours of shivering labor to bring the cabin back to livable warmth. Stoves, when available, offered a revolution in heating. Iron stoves provided more efficient heat than open fireplaces, concentrating warmth and allowing for longer burning. They also served as cooking surfaces, with flat tops for pots and pans, yet stoves were not without difficulties. They required steady attention, produced uneven heat, and filled cabins with smoke if not maintained properly. In smaller dwellings, the iron stove radiated such intense heat near its sides that sitting too close was uncomfortable, while corners of the room still froze. Still, for most families, a stove was a prized possession, a sign of both comfort and progress on the frontier. The physical warmth of the hearth was essential, but its psychological warmth was just as important. During blizzards, when winds howled against cabin walls and snow piled high against doors, the hearth became the one visible barrier between life and desolation. Children found comfort in its glow, listening to stories or singing hymns while snow rattled outside. Parents drew strength from its presence, the flame offering a reminder that their labors had secured a measure of safety. In the endless monotony of winter, the crackling of firewood provided sound, movement, and light, a sense of life in a season otherwise marked by stillness. The hearth also served as a place of work. Women cooked meals over its flames, balancing iron pots on hooks or stoves, stirring stews while children warmed their hands nearby. Clothes were dried by its side, boots placed near it to thaw after long days outside. Even water, when frozen in pails or wells, could be melted by the fire for drinking or washing. The fire did not rest, it provided warmth, light, nourishment, and utility from dawn until long after dusk. But as with food, there were times when warmth grew scarce. Families misjudged their fuel supply, storms prevented wood gathering, or sickness kept adults from their daily tasks. On such nights, families huddled closer together, relying on body heat as much as the hearth. Quilts and blankets, often layered several deep, became shields against the cold. Breath hung visibly in the air inside cabins, and water froze in buckets just feet from the stove. Yet, even in these moments, the hearth remained the fragile thread that connected them to survival. The work of maintaining heat was constant. Ashes had to be cleared to keep fires burning cleanly, logs split anew when supplies dwindled, and embers coaxed into flame when mornings proved especially cold. Children learned the rhythm of carrying in wood, of stacking it neatly to dry, of fetching fuel when their elders grew tired. The fire was a shared responsibility, woven into the daily chores of survival. The hearth carried traditions too. Holidays and gatherings centered around its glow. A Christmas candle might burn alongside it, or neighbors visiting on winter evenings would sit in its warmth, sharing news and companionship. The hearth was a stage for memory, a place where songs were sung, prayers spoken, and laughter echoed against rough cabin walls. Even in hardship, its light created moments of peace. When spring finally came, when snows melted and winds softened, the fire's role shifted. Its constant presence lessened, but its memory endured. Families who had survived another winter carried with them the knowledge that the hearth had been their shield. Each glowing ember had marked their persistence. Each log burned had been a measure of their endurance. In the vast loneliness of the prairie, where the cold could take everything, the hearth and the heat it provided meant far more than simple comfort. It meant survival, resilience, and the enduring warmth of family life. Without it, no pioneer story could have been written. With it, countless families found the strength to endure winters that might otherwise have broken them. If fire and food sustained the body through prairie winters, clothing formed the final shield against the cold. For pioneers, clothing was not about fashion or luxury, it was about endurance. Every stitch, every layer, and every scrap of cloth represented hours of labor and a measure of protection against the relentless winds of the plains. The prairie winter demanded clothing that could withstand extremes. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and winds cut through thin fabrics like knives. Unlike today, when insulated jackets and factory-made boots can be purchased easily, pioneer families relied almost entirely on what they could sew, knit, or barter. This meant that preparation began months in advance, as mothers and daughters spun wool, carded fibers, and pieced together garments from whatever materials were available. Wool was prized above all else. Sheep, when kept, provided fleeces that could be spun into warm yarn. Knitting was a constant activity, often done by firelight during long evenings. Mittens, socks, scarves, and heavy shawls flowed from the hands of women who knew that a dropped stitch could mean frostbitten fingers or toes. Quilted petticoats and woolen skirts offered layers of warmth for women, while men often wore heavy coats fashioned from wool or lined with fur. Every article of clothing carried both utility and necessity, often passed down from one family member to the next, until it could no longer be patched. Animal hides and furs also played a vital role. Deer skins could be tanned and fashioned into leggings or coats. Buffalo robes, when they could be obtained, were treasured for their incredible warmth, often used as blankets or outer coverings during travel. Rabbit pelts were stitched together into caps or hand muffs, while raccoon fur lined collars and gloves. These garments carried with them the memory of hunts and the effort of survival, each piece connecting the family to the land itself. Layering was essential. A single garment rarely provided enough protection against the prairie's sharp winds, so families dressed in layers that could be added or removed as needed. Undergarments of linen or cotton absorbed moisture, while heavier outer layers of wool or fur trapped heat. In this way, even simple clothing became a strategy of survival, designed not only for comfort but for endurance during outdoor chores, fetching wood, tending livestock, or breaking trails through snow. Footwear was another critical concern. Boots made of leather, often lined with wool or stuffed with straw, kept feet as warm as possible, though frostbite remained a constant threat. Children sometimes wore shoes that had been mended and remended, handed down from older siblings. In the deepest cold, families wrapped feet in cloth or extra stockings, layering to protect against numbness. Wet boots were dried carefully by the fire, for a single pair might need to last through multiple winters. For women, the responsibility of maintaining clothing was as constant as tending the hearth. Mending was a near daily chore. Knees wore thin, elbows frayed, hems dragged, and buttons loosened. Nothing was discarded without first being patched, restitched, or repurposed. A worn-out dress might become a quilt. A torn shirt could be cut down into children's garments. Scraps of fabric, no matter how small, were saved in baskets, later pieced together into patchwork that provided warmth as well as beauty. In this way, clothing was more than just survival, it was resourcefulness embodied in fabric and thread. Textiles also carried a sense of identity and care. Mothers often sewed garments with quiet pride, each stitch a sign of devotion to the well-being of their families. Children learned early to sew, knit, or darn socks, their small efforts contributing to the collective work of keeping everyone warm. Clothing thus became not only protection but also a shared craft, a skill passed down through generations, weaving together both fabric and tradition. During the coldest days, clothing offered not only warmth but comfort. A shawl knitted by a grandmother, a quilt pieced from scraps of old garments, or mittens stitched by a mother's hands held more than practical value. They carried memory, connection, and reassurance. In cabins where the wind moaned through cracks and snow piled against the door, wrapping oneself in these handmade garments was a reminder of care and continuity, a shield against loneliness as much as against the cold. Yet even with careful preparation, shortages were common. Children outgrew shoes faster than they could be replaced, leaving families scrambling to improvise. Gloves were lost, coats wore thin, and fabric wore out from hard use. Winters often stretched resources to the limit. Families traded with neighbors when they could, bartering wool for leather, or exchanging sewing labor for a length of cloth. In times of real scarcity, they simply endured, layering whatever was available, and relying on quilts and blankets to make up the difference. Clothing also marked special occasions, even in the harshest months. A carefully preserved dress worn only on Sundays might be taken out for church gatherings when weather permitted travel. A clean shirt or apron, kept aside for Christmas, gave moments of dignity amidst hardship. These garments, often plain by modern standards, were nonetheless tokens of hope, reminders that even in survival, there was space for ritual and respectability. When spring finally returned and the snow began to melt, clothing bore the marks of the season that had passed. Boots cracked from frost and wet, mittens frayed, coats patched upon patches, yet each garment told a story of survival. Families would once again turn to spinning, sewing, and mending, beginning the cycle anew, always aware that another winter would come. In this way, clothing and textiles stood as silent guardians of life on the prairie. They were not luxuries to be discarded, but treasures of labor, craft, and endurance. Each stitch was an act of preparation, each garment a line of defense, and each quilt or shawl a promise that warmth could be held close even as the world outside froze. In the quiet of winter nights, wrapped in wool and fur, pioneer families endured not only the cold of the prairie, but the isolation of the season itself. Their survival was written in fabric, thread, and the unending labor of hands determined to keep warmth alive. Once the winds closed in and snow sealed the prairie in silence, life shifted almost entirely indoors. Where summer had been a season of constant work in fields and gardens, winter slowed the rhythm of labor, but never removed it. Nord fus et ripens bull sows, the third stalls had scenes a miracle. Chores remained, small but steady, and filled the hours of short days and long nights. For pioneer families, winter was a time of waiting, but it was not a time of idleness. Within the close walls of cabins and sod houses, life followed a quieter but no less important routine. The day usually began before dawn. Parents rose first, rekindling the fire that had been banked the night before, shaking off the cold that had crept in overnight. The sound of crackling wood signaled the start of the day. Water, frozen in pails, was chipped and melted for washing or cooking. Children stirred awake slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of quilts, often dressing hurriedly near the stove to avoid the morning chill. Meals structured the day. Breakfast was often hearty, cornbread, porridge, or biscuits with butter if supplies allowed. A hot meal in the morning fortified the family against the cold and gave strength for chores. Dinner and supper, though simpler, became rituals as well, each meal an anchor in the monotony of winter. Gathering around the table was not only about food, but also about connection, a reminder that even in isolation, family bonds held strong. Indoor chores filled much of the daylight. Women often spent hours mending clothing, knitting socks, or spinning wool by the firelight. Every garment worn through the winter carried with it careful maintenance, and the steady rhythm of needle and thread became a constant companion. Soap making, candle dipping, and preparing dried goods for future use were also common winter tasks. The cabin smelled of tallow and wood smoke, the air heavy with the mixture of survival and domestic labor. Men, while less able to work fields in winter, found plenty to do indoors and around the homestead. Tools were repaired, harnesses mended, and furniture reinforced. A broken handle or dull blade could prove disastrous when spring came, so winter became the season of preparation, ensuring everything would be ready when the thaw arrived. Larger repairs, like fixing roof leaks or reinforcing walls, were undertaken when weather allowed. but the bulk of men's winter work often revolved around maintenance and planning. Children were not idle either. Even the youngest members of the household contributed. Boys fetched firewood or fed animals kept close to the cabin. Girls learned sewing, knitting, and cooking under their mother's guidance. Education also crept into these routines. While formal schooling was rare in isolated prairie cabins, mothers often taught children to read and write during the long months indoors. The family Bible might serve as both textbook and moral guide, its pages worn from constant use. A slate board, if available, carried arithmetic lessons scratched and erased again and again. Evenings were the quietest hours. After supper, when lamps or candles were lit, the family gathered together. The fire's glow provided warmth and light, and activities slowed. Fathers read aloud from books or newspapers, if any were available, while mothers continued sewing or knitting. Storytelling filled the gaps, with children listening to tales of family history, far-off places, or biblical parables. Hymns were sometimes sung, voices soft against the howling winds outside. In these moments the cabin became a small world of its own, cut off from the vast prairie, but alive with its own rhythm of sound and light. Leisure, though limited, also found its way indoors. Games with handmade pieces, puzzles carved from wood, or riddles shared between siblings provided small diversions. Quilting bees when neighbors could visit turned work into community, with stories and laughter shared over stitching. Music, too, was a comfort. A fiddle or harmonica, if one was owned, brought melody into the cabin. Even the simplest tune could lift spirits and provide a sense of festivity during the monotony of winter weeks. The psychological strain of confinement was very real, and daily routines helped ease it. The sameness of winter days, the constant presence of cold, and the absence of wider company could weigh heavily on families. Structure gave purpose. Chores, lessons, and shared meals offered order, where otherwise there might have been only waiting. For children especially, these routines provided both education and a sense of security. For adults, they gave the assurance that life, though slowed, continued steadily forward. Religion often infused daily life. Sundays were marked with special prayers or hymns, even when weather prevented travel to church. Reading scripture together reinforced both faith and endurance. In the isolation of the prairie, where storms could cut families off for weeks, faith became a source of inner warmth, a reminder that survival was not only physical but spiritual. In the end, daily indoor life during prairie winters was not remarkable in its variety, but in its persistence. Each day resembled the one before, marked by the same chores, the same meals, the same slow passage of time, yet within that repetition lay resilience. Families worked, prayed, learned and played together, finding small comforts and steady rhythms in a season that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. When spring finally returned, these routines faded into the busier work of fields and gardens, but their memory lingered. Winter days indoors had not been wasted. They had been stitched into clothing, carved into tools, etched into lessons learned by children, and sung into hymns that filled the long nights. In the quiet endurance of these routines, pioneer families discovered not only how to survive the prairie winter, but how to endure it with patience and grace. On the vast and often lonely prairie, survival was never truly a solitary effort. Cabins might stand miles apart, separated by windswept fields and frozen creeks. But bonds between neighbors were lifelines that carried families through the winter. Community, fragile though it sometimes was, provided strength where individual effort might falter. In the quiet isolation of the plains, the presence of others, whether near or far, offered reassurance that no family stood entirely alone. Neighbors often relied on one another long before winter set in. Harvest time saw families trading labor, helping each other bring in crops before frost could spoil them. The cutting and stacking of firewood was sometimes a shared effort, with men gathering in groups to split logs, while women prepared meals for the workers. These acts of cooperation were not only practical but essential, for one family's weakness could become the vulnerability of the whole community. Winter made such bonds all the more vital. Once snow covered the prairie, visits grew fewer but no less important. When storms passed and the roads opened, neighbors traveled by sleigh or on horseback, bringing news, supplies, or simple companionship. A knock on the cabin door might mean the arrival of a friend carrying a sack of flour, a bundle of firewood, or a jar of preserved fruit. Such gifts were small in size but immeasurable in value, tokens of care exchanged in seasons when scarcity weighed heavily. Community also meant shared work in emergencies. A family struck by illness could depend on neighbors to tend animals, chop wood, or bring meals. Childbirth in the middle of winter, far from any doctor, was attended by neighboring women, who offered skill, comfort, and the strength of presence. Death, too, when it came, was met with collective support. Neighbors built coffins, dug graves through frozen soil, and gathered together to mourn, finding solace in one another, even as winds howled outside. Barn raisings and communal butchering days highlighted the spirit of cooperation that carried over into winter. A hog slaughtered in December was often more than one family could consume, so the work and the meat were shared. Children, wide-eyed and quiet, watched as adults divided tasks, laughter mingling with the heavy labor. The meat, when preserved, fed more than one household, and the sense of unity fed spirits starved for companionship. Faith communities played a role as well. When weather allowed, families gathered for church, traveling by sled across icy fields. Services provided more than worship. They offered contact with neighbors, news from afar, and a brief sense of belonging to something larger than one's own cabin walls. Even when travel was impossible, families sometimes joined voices across the prairie, each household singing hymns at the same hour on a Sunday evening, a quiet connection felt though unseen. Letters and parcels also carried community across distance. Mail, when it arrived, brought news of relatives, words of encouragement, or small items of comfort. A pair of knitted gloves from a grandmother, a letter from a sibling in another state, or a carefully wrapped package of dried fruit became treasures. These gifts connected families not just to neighbors but to the wider network of kin and friends scattered across the frontier. Children too felt the pull of community. When weather cleared, families sometimes gathered in each other's cabins for small social visits. Games were played, songs sung, and simple meals shared. These visits, rare though they were, offered children the joy of companionship beyond their siblings, and gave parents a brief respite from the endless sameness of winter days. Community was not always idyllic. Conflicts, rivalries, and misunderstandings existed on the prairie as anywhere else. Yet winter often softened sharp edges, survival demanded cooperation, and grudges were set aside when need arose. A family might refuse help in pride, but neighbors still arrived when trouble struck, their presence a reminder that life was too fragile to risk over quarrels. In many ways, community was the unseen hearth of prairie survival. Just as fire warmed cabins and food filled bellies, the presence of neighbors warmed hearts and filled the emptiness of isolation. To know that someone might appear at the door with kind words, or that a distant lantern glowed across the frozen fields, was to carry a sense of belonging through the longest nights. When spring arrived, these bonds strengthened further. Families gathered to share stories of winter endured, to help one another rebuild fences, plant fields, or repair damage caused by storms. Each new season was entered together, with the unspoken understanding that the next winter would once again test their unity. In the endless sweep of prairie land where one family's cabin could seem like the only mark on the horizon, community was not measured in numbers but in presence. It was the steady hand that lifted a burden, the shared laugh that lightened a dark day, and the quiet knowledge that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective triumph. Though preparation, food stores, clothing, and community offered protection, winter on the prairie was never tamed completely. It remained a season of trial, testing families in ways that could not always be anticipated. Hardships pressed heavily, sometimes bringing despair, but alongside them came moments of resilience, small triumphs that gave meaning to endurance. The story of pioneer winters is not only one of suffering but of persistence in the face of it. The greatest hardship was the cold itself. Temperatures plunged without mercy, and winds swept across the open plains with a force that seemed endless. Families huddled in cabins as icy drafts crept through cracks in walls and doors. Even with fires burning steadily, corners of rooms remained frozen, water buckets iced over indoors, and breath hung visibly in the air. Children often awoke with frost clinging to blankets, and parents feared the creeping numbness of frostbite each time they stepped outside. The cold was not simply uncomfortable, it was a danger that shadowed every task. Blizzards posed an even greater threat. When storms rolled across the prairie, they swallowed the land in white. Visibility vanished within moments, and snow piled high against doors and windows. Families could be trapped for days, sometimes weeks, unable to fetch wood or reach outbuildings where food was stored. Stories survive of travelers caught in blizzards only yards from their homes, lost in the disorienting swirl of snow. Inside, the howling wind pressed against walls, shaking cabins until they seemed to tremble under the weight of winter's power. Illness was another constant fear. Winter confined families together in close quarters, and diseases spread quickly. A cough might deepen into pneumonia, a small fever into a serious threat. Medical care was scarce, and doctors often miles away, their arrival delayed by snow or storm. Parents sat through sleepless nights, listening to the labored breathing of children, doing what little they could with home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, prayers whispered into the dark. Sometimes those remedies were enough. Other times winter claimed lives despite every effort. Hunger, too, was a hardship that could not always be avoided. Despite careful planning, stores ran low, crops spoiled, cellars flooded, or jars cracked in the freeze. Families learned to stretch what they had, boiling thin soups, mixing flour with whatever could be found, or going without meat for long stretches. Children felt the pangs most acutely, and parents bore the sorrow of watching their little ones eat less than they needed. Yet even in scarcity, families shared what they could, neighbors trading or lending supplies in the hope that all might reach spring together. Isolation weighed on the spirit as heavily as hunger weighed on the body. With travel difficult and weather harsh, families sometimes went weeks without seeing another soul. Days blurred into one another, broken only by small routines. The silence of the prairie could feel vast and unyielding, the sense of being alone magnified by the endless snow outside. Loneliness gnawed quietly, and many found comfort only in prayer, song, or the companionship of family gathered close around the fire. Yet alongside these hardships, moments of triumph also defined the pioneer winter. Each challenge carried with it the chance for resilience, and survival itself became a victory. When storms passed and families emerged from their cabins to see the sky cleared, relief washed over them like sunlight. Children laughed as they tumbled in the snow, their joy a reminder that life persisted even in hardship. Parents felt renewed strength in knowing they had endured yet another test. Triumph was found in small successes, a loaf of bread rising well in the oven, despite dwindling flour, a jar of preserved fruit opened in the dead of winter, a pair of boots mended in time, to save a child's feet from frostbite. These moments, modest as they were, built the foundation of resilience. They reminded families that preparation and perseverance mattered, that effort could carry them through. Community, too, provided moments of triumph. When neighbors appeared at the door with supplies, when shared labor lightened burdens, or when hymns were sung together, despite bitter cold, the bonds of humanity triumphed over isolation. Acts of kindness, small gifts, shared meals, or even a visit through deep snow, were victories of spirit. They proved that survival was not only about endurance, but about compassion carried across frozen miles. Faith was often the deepest source of triumph. Families turned to prayer, to scripture, and to the belief that winter was a season to be endured, not feared. Hymns sung softly around the fire lifted hearts, even as winds rattled the cabin. Faith offered the assurance that hardship was temporary, that spring would return, and that survival carried meaning beyond the present struggle. Perhaps the greatest triumph was simply reaching spring. Each thaw marked not just the change of seasons but the survival of families who had been tested by hunger, cold, and loneliness. The sight of green shoots breaking through snowmelt, the sound of rivers flowing again, and the warmth of sun on faces long chilled by wind were victories no words could fully capture. For families who had feared they might not endure, spring was not just a season, it was proof of their strength. In this balance of hardship and triumph, the story of prairie winters becomes clear. It was never an easy season, and for many it brought sorrow as well as endurance. But each hardship carried within it the possibility of resilience, and each triumph, no matter how small, reminded families why they endured. The prairie demanded much, but it also taught lessons of patience, perseverance, and the quiet courage found in everyday survival. As the long arc of winter gives way to the promise of spring, the story of the prairie pioneers finds its gentle close. Their survival was never marked by grand victories or dramatic gestures, but by the steady rhythm of ordinary persistence. Each task, gathering firewood, mending clothes, preparing meals, caring for livestock, was a quiet act of endurance. In the stillness of winter, surrounded by vast fields of snow and endless sky, life carried on one small step at a time. Looking back, it is easy to imagine the prairie winter only as hardship, but the reality is more complex. True, families faced cold that threatened their very breath, storms that locked them away for days, and hunger that gnawed at their strength. Yet these very challenges revealed resilience that might otherwise have remained hidden. Hardship shaped endurance, and endurance shaped identity. To survive a prairie winter was to earn a quiet pride, one not shouted aloud, but held deeply in the heart. The pioneers' lives remind us that survival is not always about dramatic struggle, but about patience and persistence. Their triumphs were not found in conquering the land outright, but in living alongside it, adjusting to its demands, and finding ways to endure. A loaf of bread baked with care, a lantern lit through a stormy night, or a child bundled warm against the cold, these were victories as meaningful as any larger achievement. Community, too, left its lasting mark. No family endured winter entirely alone, even when cabins stood miles apart. Bonds of cooperation, neighbors sharing food, families helping one another through illness, gatherings at church or around a shared meal, created a web of connection strong enough to carry people through the hardest months. These bonds, woven in hardship, gave shape to prairie society long after individual winters had passed. Faith and hope carried families forward as much as food and firewood did. Hymns sung in flickering candlelight, prayers whispered over a sick child, or simply the quiet belief that spring would come again provided comfort that no material storehouse could replace. For many, faith was the inner fire that matched the one burning in their hearth, steady and sustaining through the longest nights. When spring finally arrived, when rivers thawed, when green shoots pushed up through melting snow, and when birds returned to the skies, it was more than a change of season. It was a confirmation of survival. Families stepped out of cabins with relief, gratitude, and renewed determination. The hardships of winter did not vanish, but they were folded into memory, part of the larger story of resilience on the prairie. Today, when we reflect on those lives, we may find their world distant from our own. Modern winters are softened by warm homes, stocked stores, and instant communication. Yet there is still something deeply calming about imagining the rhythm of life in those earlier times. The pioneers remind us of the strength found in simplicity, the way ordinary routines, shared bonds, and quiet perseverance can see us through even the harshest seasons. For viewers listening now, perhaps in the comfort of a warm room, this story of prairie winters is more than history. It is also an invitation to rest, to let the mind wander across snowy fields, to imagine the glow of a hearth within a small log cabin, and to feel the slow rhythm of life lived closer to the land. In this gentle reflection, history becomes not just knowledge, but a source of calm. And so, as we close our journey through the winter of pioneer families, let us carry with us their lesson, that survival is not only about strength, but about patience, not only about struggle, but about endurance, and not only about hardship, but about the quiet triumphs that come when people care for one another and hold fast through the storm. In the end, the story of prairie winters is not one of despair, but of balance, of hardship and resilience, of cold nights and warm fires, of isolation and community. It is the story of ordinary people who, through persistence, faith, and quiet courage, transformed survival into a way of life. Their example, though distant in time, continues to remind us of the simple strength within the human spirit. As the last snow drifts melt away in our imagination, and the prairie grass sways gently in the returning wind, the story draws to its close. The pioneers endured, the seasons turned, and life went on. So too, for us, winter passes, spring returns, and calm follows struggle. It is a rhythm as old as the land itself, and as comforting as the steady glow of a fire on a cold night.